Hello and welcome to another episode on the Everyday Joy podcast. A couple of days ago, I got an amazing email from Selena. She emailed through to everydayjoy@positivemedia.com.au and she said, I'm so inspired that I'm trying to put together a group of friends and friends of friends where we can all study the choice of scriptures and maybe reflect on our lives and how these teachings relate to us. And I love that. I love the fact that this podcast is enabling you to reach out to the other people in your world who can grow and develop from this. And I hope you listening have been able to get a lot out of this podcast. And maybe if there's been something particularly that you love about it, an episode, a topic, maybe the whole podcast in general, I would love to hear your feedback. And you can email that through to everydayjoy@positivemedia.com.au. All of this week, we have been deep diving into the top 5 episodes on this podcast, and I hope you've been enjoying those. I'd love to do this again in a few months' time, so your emails and your feedback really does help me decide which ones you want to hear more of. Right now, though, let's get into today's Bible verse.
Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. That's from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 and 2.
Once again, I've got MJ here in studio with me. A very special series this week where we unpack some of the more powerful moments on the Everyday Joy podcast. We've just ticked over 50 episodes, believe it or not. It's been super exciting, and it's really touching to hear what stories are resonating with you listening. And in today's episode, we are going to unpack episode 41 titled You Will Get Through. And in this episode, Sharon shares how her decision to become a Christian really impacted her life in a negative way. Although it worked out in the end, and you can listen to the whole podcast episode, today we're talking about the fact that sometimes a good decision can have a bad impact on those around us, and how do we navigate through that? Here's a little bit from that episode.
I worked up enough courage to tell my parents a few months later. My parents didn't welcome the news, to put it mildly. The way they saw it, for a Jew to believe in Jesus was the ultimate betrayal of their faith, their community, their identity. And personally too, they felt I'd betrayed them as my parents. Difficult times. There was a lot of hurt. I had to leave home. When a Jew believes in Jesus, they're cut off from their family and community. So my dad held a funeral for me at his local synagogue. There were tough times, and they were absolutely ripped apart by what I'd done. It was such a shameful thing that I'd done. So the next few years, as you can hear in my voice, were really tough emotionally. So it got to the point where I felt completely unloved and completely unlovable. And that's when this verse kicked in. I wrote it out and I stuck it on my fridge. And every day, every morning, minute by minute, sometimes, I looked at that fridge, I looked at that verse, and I remembered that God loves me.
I have to say, MJ, that was one of the hardest episodes I ever had to record.
Yeah.
And you can hear her emotion as she's sharing that story. But one of the things that actually happened behind the scenes with this conversation was we had to pause a few times, where she had to, stop and just kind of gather herself. And I just want to commend her and all the other amazing podcast guests on the show who have been so open and so vulnerable, because these things do happen.
Yeah.
You do find yourself in situations where a God decision you've made has caused a rift, because people love it when you stay the same. And when you decide to change, not everyone's happy about it.
Yeah, there's this cost that comes to following Jesus. It's not just giving up of sinful desires or selfish desires. Sometimes when we think about giving up everything and following Jesus, we think, I'm going to give up partying and good times and free will and all those things. But as Sharon talked about, she gave up her family. Relationships to do that. Others have given up career paths, have said goodbye to deep friendships that they've had and deep desires and yearnings that they've had to do that. And there is this unintended sometimes or unknown cost that comes with following Jesus, that we make that decision, whatever that looks like, and now, there's this part and parcel of it. When I was a youth pastor, I would often tell young people all the time, it's like that scene in the movie Aladdin, where Aladdin, spoiler alert, where Aladdin tricks Jafar into this final wish, where to become this most all-powerful sorcerer and this all-powerful genie. To come with that is this itty bitty living space. And sometimes when we pursue Jesus and say yes to following him, there's these unintended or unknown things or big things that we do know that we're like, to receive this gift of love and salvation and grace means I've got to say no to this or pass this thing by. And man, there is a cost, but with that comes an incredible wave of love from God.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what that episode goes into. So do make sure you listen to episode 41, because Sharon shares how in that moment God came through for her. MJ, has this story come alive for you in any way, or have you ever walked through something similar?
Yeah, I think really regularly, as you say yes to Jesus, like even if you just look at that first moment, now depending on your faith background, that might manifest in different ways, from your upbringing, from the style of church you were brought up in. But even for me, in the very instance, it was a friend invited me to church. I went along. My parents were Christian. I went to a Christian school, but I was like, it just feels really obstructive to my life. There were certain things that as I encountered the goodness of God personally and was presented with the love of God, I realized very quickly how much that was a deep need in my world and that I needed God to intervene in my world. But what about for you? Like what was that moment? Because I think people having a faith, it all starts somewhere. Where did this faith journey for you start? Because obviously along the way there would have been saying yes to some things and no along the way. Where did that start for you?
Well, I think I had two main moments. Okay. There was the first moment when I was 6 years old, and I remember it so clearly. I remember running downstairs. My parents were in the foyer and having their cups of tea, and I was like, I'm saved, I'm saved, I'm saved. And I was so excited. And the couple who, I think they had this little ministry, and so they would get the person's name and double check with the parents. And over the next month, I got these little letters in the mail, which is a huge thing for a 6-year-old. And I remember it being such a beautiful experience. And I think that was my first moment, and my family were really supportive. I think my second moment where I decided to commit my life to God was a lot more challenging. And I have to preface this by saying that I love my parents and they love me, and we've had some amazing moments of reconciliation and restoration through all of this. But being a second generation immigrant, my parents gave up everything they knew and everyone they loved so that I could have a better opportunity in New Zealand, which is where they immigrated to from India. So right from the get-go, I was very much aware of the fact that my parents were living a much tougher life so that I could have a better one. And so when I was in school and I started doing quite well academically, Mum and Dad had high aspirations for me, and they were very nurturing and supportive of my abilities, especially in the science field. And if you come from an Asian background, you probably already know where this is going. But it was very much you're going to be a doctor one day. But it was so much more than that, because I think I started tuition from the age of 12.
Wow.
So I had like tuition for physics, biology, chemistry, calculus, stats, all through my college years. I did like pre-med tests before, like 2 years before med school. My mum and my dad invested a lot of money in textbooks and the right materials. And I mean, I could just go on and on and on about how much investment they put into my life. When I did my first year at Auckland University, Biomedical Sciences, it's notorious for being an incredibly challenging year.
Right.
But that doesn't even begin to describe the experience I had. I had never felt more isolated and alone. I just felt like rubbish, because I had so much expectation from my mum and my dad. Still getting emotional about it because it was a really tough time. And you know when you have years and years of investment and you know you just can't do it. So I made a decision to, and I really felt like it was a God moment. I really felt like God saying, this is actually not where you're meant to be. So you're going to do, well, he didn't say it to me in that way, but through a series of God moments, I figured out that, right, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to pursue media and communication. To say that it was betrayal feels like too much of a soft word. At a lot of our Indian sort of gatherings and community spaces, it was talked about that, Joy's going to go and do this. And so for about 3 years, I couldn't show my face. And for 3 years, my grades weren't very good and I was still doing this whole media thing and I was so lost and so confused. For 3 years, MJ, I was like, what am I doing with my life? But every day, or close to every day, I really felt like God was there for me. And I think that's where my real salvation story began, because up until that moment, it had never really been tested. Then, of course, my life took a different direction, and then I got involved with radio, and, you know, here I am years later doing this podcast, and it's just such an incredible privilege. But I had to go through 3 years of everyone thinking, or how I perceived everyone to think of me. I'm sure it wasn't the case, but that I was going nowhere, that I was the girl who couldn't make it to med school, that I was the girl who had all the potential but threw it all away. So that's one of the reasons why I feel like God really does draw close in those moments. And sometimes he has to take us through those moments for us to not get too big-headed in moments like this. I'm glad I went through those 3 years now, because I think if I hadn't, man, I wouldn't have fit through the door of the studio, MJ. I think I probably would have, my head would have been too big. But yeah, I love this verse. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. For me in my own life, that verse came alive because I really had nothing to give in those 3 years. I was no longer the shiny poster child. But in those moments, God's love for me was so evident, and it's something that I can still cling on to today. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 to 2. Observe how God loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. Sharon shared a time in her life where God was so close to her when it seemed like she was unlovable. I shared a time in my life where I felt terribly unworthy and I felt like such a disappointment. And in that time, God loved me. And today's application on the Everyday Joy podcast is to revisit that time in your life where God showed up for you when you felt like you didn't deserve it. I think sometimes we can all too quickly forget those moments, or sometimes we don't want to think of them. But there's a true gift in going back to those times, because it reminds us again how extravagantly God loves us. Maybe for you, you are in that season. God is writing that particular chapter of your life right now. I hope that by listening to Sharon's story and my story, you can rest assured knowing that, number one, this won't last forever. You will get through. In fact, that's the title of the episode where Sharon shared her story earlier. The other takeaway from today's conversation is that nothing will be wasted. I know that I needed to go through that experience in order for me to have my head screwed on doing what I'm doing now. I know that for Sharon as well, she needed to go through that experience in her life to be doing what she's doing now in her different roles. And you never know how God is going to use the challenge you're facing right now to be a blessing tomorrow. So stay strong, be brave, and focus on today's verse, knowing you are extravagantly loved.